Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're diving straight into the gritty reality behind one of the most recognizable structures on the planet. We're talking about an absolute military masterpiece that snakes its way for thousands of kilometers, stretching from freezing western deserts all the way to the Yellow Sea. For centuries, locals have called it the Stone Dragon, but of course we know it as the Great Wall of China. Now, beyond the gorgeous tourist photos you see on social media, there's a truly gripping story here. It's a tale of sheer engineering brilliance, totally brutal logistics, and frankly, unimaginable human sacrifice. So, let's get into it.
So, right off the bat, you might be wondering, did it really take 2,000 years to build this thing? And the staggering answer is, absolutely yes. See, this wasn't just a single construction project they knocked out in a few decades. It was a relentless 2-millennia-long campaign of building, adapting, and reinforcing. Over the next few minutes, we're going to trace the source material to uncover the absolute why and how behind this colossal monument. We'll explore the intense geopolitical pressures that practically forced its creation and the mind-blowing ancient engineering that actually made it possible.
Section 1. The Nomadic Threat. Okay, to really understand why you'd even build a massive defensive shield like this, we've got to look at the root cause, and it all boils down to a pretty stark contrast in survival. On one hand, you had the steppe nomads, out in the incredibly harsh conditions of the Gobi Desert and the vast grasslands. They relied on a pastoral mobile economy. Short growing seasons, frequent droughts. Basically, survival was tough. On the other hand, you have the Chinese Empire. They're blessed with the fertile valleys of the Yellow River, supporting a huge, settled agricultural society. Naturally, the nomads needed grains, tools, and just basic necessities from the agrarian Chinese. But when the Chinese states flat out refused to trade, well, those nomadic groups essentially had no choice but to take what they needed by force, and that led to constant, absolutely devastating border clashes.
These relentless northern incursions were a massive problem. They threatened the very lifeblood of the entire Chinese Empire. So those very first early walls were built primarily to protect their massive grain storehouses and, crucially, the incredibly lucrative Silk Route. They desperately needed a physical barrier to stop fast-moving nomadic cavalry from just riding in, looting all their wealth in a flash, and riding right back out.
Section 2. From Earth to Stone.
Now, the wall didn't always look like that impenetrable stone dragon we picture today. Way back in 221 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang was the first to unite a bunch of smaller feudal walls into one long, continuous barrier. Later on, the Han dynasty extended it all the way out to the Bohai Sea. But here's the crucial turning point: 1550 CE. Nomadic Mongol forces actually breached those old walls, poured over the mountain ranges, and literally terrorized the citizens of Beijing for days. This was a horrific, eye-opening security failure. It proved once and for all that the old barriers just weren't cutting it anymore, completely forcing the Ming dynasty to rethink their border defenses from the ground up.
You see, the early barriers built by the Qin and Han dynasties were essentially just big mounds of rammed earth, a sandy soil they call loess, and wood. Basically, glorified mud walls. They were incredibly vulnerable to weather erosion and, as that 1550 attack perfectly demonstrated, way too easy for determined invaders to breach. But the Ming dynasty upgrades? That's what transformed the wall into a true fortress. They transitioned to solid stone, massive granite blocks, and these heavy, kiln-fired bricks. It's a classic case of sheer necessity driving an unbelievable leap in ancient engineering.
Section 3. Engineering a masterpiece. So how exactly did they pull this off? Well, to stop the walls from sinking or just collapsing under their own weight, engineers laid massive granite blocks deep into the earth as a foundation. Then, the outer body was constructed with these meticulously smooth bricks, which made it practically impossible for enemy soldiers to scale. We are talking about an imposing structure averaging 23 feet high and 21 feet wide. That's literally wide enough to march an entire army across the top. And remember, this wasn't just a passive, dead wall. They built something like 25,000 specialized watchtowers into it. If an enemy approached, soldiers could use fire and smoke signals to instantly transmit warnings across hundreds of miles. They essentially turned the wall into a highly active, fully garrisoned military machine.
And the sheer scale of the materials is just mind-boggling. Building conservation experts have pointed out that the bricks used in the Great Wall are 4 times larger than the standard bricks we use to build our own homes today. Imagine that. This massive size added immense weight and structural integrity, meaning once these huge bricks were joined together, the bond was virtually unbreakable.
Section 4. The Brick Production Logistics.
But creating this engineering triumph sparked a massive logistical nightmare. Think about it. How on earth do you manufacture and transport millions upon millions of these giant bricks across vast, totally wild mountainous terrain? Well, the empire deployed its absolute best master craftsmen to invent a highly specialized and honestly pretty dangerous chemical firing process. Laborers worked in sweltering conditions, often documented at an exhausting 43 degrees Celsius right around the kilns. But the real genius here was the airflow. Craftsmen designed specialized chimneys to very carefully regulate the heat. Why? Because if one of those massive bricks heated up too fast, the moisture trapped inside would rapidly turn to steam, causing the brick to literally explode right there in the kiln. It required absolute, perfect precision on a monumental scale.
And the nightmare didn't end at the kilns either. Imagine the sensory shock of stepping away from a 43-degree brick kiln and having to immediately transport those incredibly heavy, oversized bricks up freezing, isolated mountain peaks. Imagine trying to hike a freezing, snowy mountain. Now imagine doing it with a boulder tied to your back. Because of the rugged terrain, they couldn't exactly just roll up some carts. There was really only one transportation method available: manpower. People literally carry these massive bricks on their own backs. They even got creative and tied bricks to the backs of flocks of goats just to get materials up the sheer cliff faces.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of this labor, let's look at a specific historical artifact found by expert historian William Lindesay. He uncovered a surviving stone engraving that detailed a mobilization effort from the autumn of 1579. Get this. To build just a tiny 230-meter stretch of the wall, the government drafted 1,100 families into service. That equates to roughly 4,500 people mobilized to build just a few hundred yards of wall. When you scale that ratio up to a barrier spanning thousands of kilometers, the sheer amount of labor required just totally breaks the human mind.
Section 5. The tragic human cost.
Which unfortunately brings us to the darkest reality of the wall's construction. This monument was absolutely not built by willing volunteers. 1 million. That is the estimated number of soldiers, peasants, and even convicts who were forced to pour their blood and sweat into this project over its history. Entire generations were drafted into a brutal system of forced labor just to keep the empire safe.
And tragically, out of that million, it's estimated that roughly 400,000 people died during the construction. Just let that sink in for a second. 400,000 souls. They perished not just from the backbreaking work, but from absolute exhaustion, frequent construction accidents on those steep cliffs, and severe starvation due to the incredibly harsh living conditions.
Now, there's a persistent, grim myth out there that the bones of the dead were ground up and used as mortar to hold the bricks together. While archaeological evidence doesn't actually support finding bones in the mortar itself, the reality was just as bleak. Ancient texts and poems confirm that fallen laborers were simply thrown into massive mass graves dug right beside the very walls they perished building. Meaning, the structure literally traces a massive graveyard across the entire spine of China.
And really, that duality is what makes the Great Wall so compelling to study. Today, millions of tourists walk along its beautifully paved upper layers, snapping photos and marveling at the smooth bricks and massive granite foundations. But as we've seen in today's explainer, every single stone was placed there through immense human suffering, alongside brilliant, desperate engineering designed to hold back a relentless nomadic threat. So I want to leave you with this provocative question to reflect on. Was the ultimate architectural and logistical triumph of the ancient world truly worth the devastating, immeasurable human sacrifice required?